Okay, so yeah, just I don't know if anybody came in after I said it, but you can. We had an intensive study session yesterday that covered units 8 and 9, and that's this link at the top here. And then I'm going to be recording this as well, so if you want to review it or whatever, you can always do that. Or if you're not here, you can. If you're not here, I'm not talking to you, but you can. Other people can see the review session. Anyway, tests. What we're going to do now is go over Unit 7 on the wiki. And just look at the points you need to know. So, and also, like, I don't know if I recorded the study tips part, but look on the, I'm not going to go over that again. Like, there's certain things you can do as you prepare for the test that can help you do better. And I believe that's on the stuff I recorded for yesterday's study session, so I'm not going to repeat it now. What we're going to do with our time now is just go through the study points and what you need to know. And the first point here, well, we actually talked about that last night, I think. Understand the point made about considering Native Americans as one group versus diversity within the group. And that really does apply to all cultural groups. And so what you need to know, basically, the point you need to know is that Native Americans don't like often being lumped together and considered as one thing, because there is a fair bit of diversity in terms of different tribes and so on. So there's that. And then but the other aspect is that they do feel that they have commonalities with other Native Americans from other tribes as compared to the mainstream. And so we don't want to, like, we're talking about them as one group is the idea here, and we don't want to forget that there is diversity and there's a lot of different practices within Native American groups. But then the other part is that even Native Americans feel an affinity for other Native Americans. So that means, affinity means you feel kind of like you have similarities with other people, especially when you compare Native Americans to the mainstream. And then the next study guide point is this point here: understand government policy regarding Native Americans, and so on. And we kind of talked about how the policy shifted in the mid-1800s. And so there's a policy kind of pre-mid-1800s and a policy that's post that. And does anybody know what the government policies were and how they were different earlier in the country's history, the U.S.'s history, and then later kind of getting towards the 1900s and beyond? How was the policy different, or what was the policy? Well, it says here, Native Americans were taught the European American way of life, and that's a policy of assimilation. And what I can say about this and what you need to know is kind of the policy of assimilation was practiced early in the country's history up until the mid-1800s. And it doesn't say it on, the person who wrote this doesn't say it, but many, like on the video, if you look at it, many children were taken away from their families and put in boarding schools. I think I have picture of a guy who, you know, before and after, like before he was in the boarding school and after. And so that's the boarding school. But this is what he looked like before, and this is what he looked like after. And so people were put on these boarding schools and prohibited from speaking the language of their culture of origin or engaging in cultural practices of their culture of origin. And they really were. The idea is, let's teach them to not have the values or not retain the values from their culture of origin, and teach them how to be quote unquote American. And that is a policy of assimilation. That's the idea. But then, does anybody remember what happened when Native Americans were seen as less of a threat? There was a different way of dealing with Native Americans. Yeah, so that's like later here. That's what started to happen, is instead of taking them to boarding schools and trying to make them like European Americans, the idea is they're not so much of a threat. Let's just give them some land that they can call their own, and they can manage it. And that's a policy of separation. The idea is we don't have to teach them to be American. They can be Native American or Indian, is how people used to say it then. And that would be okay. So it moved from a policy of assimilation to one of separation. And that's all you need to know for that point. Now, for Schwartz's values, there's two things you need to know. Well, there's three things, really. He had three values, main values that he thought countries varied on: harmony versus mastery, hierarchy versus egalitarianism, and he called it autonomy versus conservatism, but it's individualism, collectivism. And so for two of those values, we said Native Americans tend to differ from the mainstream and endorse certain other values. And so does anybody remember what those values are? What do you think? Let's start with individualism, collectivism. What will be your guess? Would Native Americans, compared to people from the mainstream, be, yeah?
I guess collectivism is a person in terms of their culture. They're very like family oriented. That's a huge thing in collectivism.
Yeah, so collectivism is correct, and we also said how, like, I don't know if you remember this, but if you watch a video, there's a football coach. He's European American, but he's on a Hopi reservation in a high school there, and he says, you know, the kids I'm coaching, if they're up by 7 points, they don't want to keep pushing and try to make the other team look bad. You know, the idea is we're up 7, and that's okay. We don't have to keep pushing harder, and that's, you know, a more collectivist way of thinking, or an example of it. We also talked, and you don't need to know this, you just need to know collectivism, but about, like, what are the qualities of a good leader? And people asked Native American adolescents and European American adolescents that, and the Native American adolescents were far more likely to see leadership as being service to other people, where European American kids, it was more like they're assertive and they lead and other people follow them. So they're very different kind of, I don't know, I mean, these are stereotypes and we want to be careful about it, but they're generally speaking, we can say that collectivism is more emphasized. The other one is harmony versus mastery, where there's a clear pattern. Does anybody remember what harmony versus mastery is? Yeah, you've got your hand up. Now you've got your face up. I'm looking at you. Always people think I'm looking at you. That's getting at it. But the idea with harmony, it could be with other people or the environment. So I don't know if that helps you get anything in mind here, but part of it is like the harmony. If you're oriented towards harmony, you change yourself to fit in with your social and your physical environment. And mastery is where you change your environment to suit yourself. Now, both values are used in any cultural group, but the idea is that typically Native Americans, on average, tend to emphasize harmony more. So an example of this with the environment that I was mentioning, that you don't need to know, you just need to know harmony is emphasized and collectivism is emphasized, and not. So the other part would be people would be lower on individualism and lower on mastery. But I said, Native Americans, and this is a stereotype, it doesn't always happen, but if they have land that is theirs, like a reservation or whatever you want to call it, they often won't want the land to be disrupted. They won't want people to mine on their land or drill and things like that because it's not good for the natural environment. So that's an example of harmony. So two of Schwartz's values, collectivism and harmony, there's clarity on that Native Americans tend to value those things more, and the opposite, individualism and mastery, are valued less. The thing you need to know about the last Schwartz value, hierarchy versus egalitarianism, is that there's no clear statement made by researchers about that particular value. So that's what you need to know about that. So just to say it again, when you're doing your study guide prep, collectivism, harmony, and nothing, the verdict's out on hierarchy versus egalitarianism. That's what you need to know. The points made about family organization. Does anybody remember me talking about this? I don't know why you would, really, because you have lots of classes. I remember what I said because I've said it for like 10 years. But what I said, just to give you a break, is, and what you should know, is that often, especially first of all, extended family will live together, and fictive kin may be part of the extended family. So these are people who are not blood relatives but are considered the same as relatives, and they're called that, like uncle or aunt or grandma, etc., even though they may not be that by blood. And the other thing is that often, or more frequently anyway, one of these adults who's not the biological mother or father, but maybe an aunt, biological or not, or a grandparent, they're the primary caregiver. And that's important to know. Because if you're working with a family, you may think, well, gosh, this parent doesn't know that much about what's going on with their child. And the reason might be that, and you might want to ask that, who is the person who's the child's primary caregiver? You don't want to just assume that it is the mother or the father. So that's what you need to know about that. And that covers this next point too, really. qualities people attempt to instill in children. Does anybody know what we said about that? I think it, this one we have to look at the PowerPoint. It's about developmental expectations. I don't know. Yeah? Yeah. Like the way I would say it, and like the way it might be worded on the test, is that they expect kids to do things by themselves at younger ages. So I'm just rewording what you said, but you might want to look for, if there is a question, it probably is going to be worded something like that. And you can see that on this overhead. And then we said, well, like if it's a collectivist, if collectivism is emphasized in this group, why are kids expected to do things by themselves at an earlier age? Yeah. Or either of you. I don't know. Like, people never know when I'm looking at them. And I think it's because of my glasses, but it might be my personality. I don't know. But who wants to take it? Or Shaquille, do you want? What's that? Yeah, the idea is, like, for most of these things, if kids do it at a younger age, it helps the family out. So that's the idea behind this. That, it might look like they're doing things independently, but actually they're helping their group out by doing it. So you need to know that, and that's pretty much the qualities people attempt to instill in children. Collectivism is one, but also self-sufficiency in service of helping the family out. Okay, there's two things we said about elders. And what are those things? Does anybody remember? It might say that on the study guide. I don't know. Yeah, so that's one. Is they're given more respect, usually, and thought of as wise, as compared to the mainstream. What's the other point? Yeah, even though that's the case, they're very vulnerable to poverty. And so it sounds contradictory. You don't need to know how the contradiction might be resolved. But, well, it says here, not all elderly people live on reservations, first of all. Many are in urban areas where there might not be the same support system. You don't need to know that for the test, though. What you need to know is they're thought of as wise and consulted in tribal decision-making, but do have difficulties with poverty. And then we talked about gender roles and single female families. And there's a few things to know, but there's one kind of big thing about gender roles with Native Americans when you consider Native Americans as one group. I don't know if I'm making sense. But what is one thing to say about gender roles? They rock. I don't know. I don't know why anybody would know what I'm talking about. What I'm trying to get at is they vary from tribe to tribe. Like in some tribes, females have the most power. And like if on the videos, a lot of it is on a Hopi reservation where females are the leaders. And if males if a husband and wife split up, females get all the possessions. A man doesn't have anything. So some tribes, are matriarchal or women have power, and then other tribes are patriarchal. The males have more power, and things are centered around males. So one basic point is gender roles vary from tribe to tribe. They're not always the same from tribe to tribe. But then we said, but for women, regardless of what their role is, usually what's thought, and some of this might be because of collectivism, and everybody's got a role to play that's important for the family and the larger group. It's said in your text that females' roles tend to be valued more than in the mainstream. And the idea would be whatever the role the woman plays, it's contributing meaningfully to the well-being of the larger group. And then what's said about men is, regardless of whether things are centered around men or women, men always play a role in socializing children. And so you should know that for the test. Women's roles, I mean, you know, there's exceptions to the rules, but on average, the first point is gender roles vary, but women's roles tend to be valued more than in the mainstream. And for men, regardless of what they're doing, they're always playing some sort of role in socializing their kids. So that's kind of what you need to know about gender roles. There's one last point, and we want to be careful about it because it feeds into stereotypes. But it is said that males' roles as warrior tend to be valued. And so often urban powwows, where people come from all sorts of different tribes and get together, one of the first things they do is they honor military veterans, people who served in the military, in the U.S. military. But this is still a valued role, is the idea. What do we say about single female families? I don't know if anyone remembers. You look like you might talk, so yeah. And what, does anybody remember what we said? Yeah. We didn't actually say that. That for African American families, we did say that. I've never read anything one way or the other that way for Native Americans. What's that? Yeah. Uh-huh. That's it. Like first of all, rates are rising, and they are for like across society, and within any group they're rising. But what's really concerning, like you say, for Native Americans is that they're very vulnerable to poverty, and so you know I had a stat, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's something like this. For the average single female family, poverty rates are about 20%, which is higher than what is the average for the country as a whole. It's about double. But for Native Americans, it's closer to 80% are in poverty. So, you know, any single female family, the idea is may be vulnerable to this issue, but for Native Americans, it's really an issue. Okay, and then we said, well, the next study guide point is know the basic point about healthcare, traditional mainstream methods. And I don't know what this is saying, but that doesn't really have anything to do with what you need to know. So, does anybody remember what we said about healthcare? Here's what you need to know. Often, Native Americans are not, and this is stereotype, so keep it in mind, but what is said is often Native Americans are not resistant to participating in the mainstream healthcare system, but typically they will want to, if they have a child who's sick or any family member, they will want to engage in their traditional practices like medicinal practices before taking part in the mainstream system. And so if you're working with a family, you may think they're resistant to kind of getting involved in the mainstream healthcare system, but typically, it doesn't always work that way, but typically it might be the case that, well, they just want to try out their traditional practices before they resort to the mainstream healthcare system. So that's what you need to know about that. And then know how religion and everyday life are related. Well, what they're saying here is kind of true. Like, the idea is in the mainstream, and this is stereotype, so not everybody's like this in the mainstream, but you go to church on Sunday and then you have the rest of your life. Well, I don't know if that always characterizes the mainstream, but the idea is, compared to Native Americans, there's more of a sense of the two things being separate, and that for Native Americans, spirituality is just a part of everyday life. And especially nature, is seen as being spiritual. So if you walk outside, you're having a spiritual experience just by virtue of, being in nature. So what you need to know is they're more intertwined for Native Americans. And then there's a number of points about habits of communication. And some are here. So one is, the idea is, the norm is, if you don't have anything important to say, don't say anything. Again, that's a stereotype. It's not every Native American person's going to be like this, but it could be the case. And so if somebody's quiet around you, that doesn't mean that they're not interested in you or anything like that. It could be that there's this different norm. In the mainstream, the norm is more like, if you're with somebody, even if you don't know them, if you're in an elevator, it's raining outside, or you say something, whatever it is, and it's small talk. But the idea is, if you're Native American, you're more likely anyway to use silence as the default. And that doesn't indicate a lack of interest in the other person or a lack of respect. Then the other 2 points here are ways of showing respect for Native Americans could be, or are more likely to be, by not making direct eye contact. And like, if you ask me a question directly, I'll turn to another person and talk to them, if you're an authority figure. Are you? Well, if you're not now, maybe you will be someday. But anyway, I'll talk to another person, and the idea is, like, you might be thinking, what? Like, why is he never looking at me or not answering me directly? And the idea is, well, it's not that he's not interested in you or put off by you or whatever you might think. It's actually a way of showing respect. So you don't want to just mindlessly think that about every Native American person you meet, but you want to keep that in your head as a possibility, because it might help you out in situations, like, say you're a social worker or a healthcare worker working with Native Americans. Okay, and then know the points made about marriage of Native Americans to non-Native individuals. And there's kind of like 2 things you need to know here. One is about marriage rates. Does anybody know what marriage rates are of Native Americans to non-Native individuals? They're increasing and they're high. For African Americans or European Americans, you from year to year you see different rates, but they're always like 10% or lower. For Native Americans, they're usually like 70 or 80%. and the other thing is people are really worried about their culture disappearing as a result of that. And you see a mom, a mother, they're Native American, they're from different tribes, but they live in an urban setting, they married each other, and they want their son to marry Native. And the mother's talking about this, but the boy says, you know, well, I'm in a high school where there aren't any other Native Americans. What does she think I'm going to do? And so there's that. But her, you know, his mother is interested about having Native values, broadly speaking, preserved and having that in her family. And that's why she's, you know, worried about her son and who he marries. Okay, and then this next one is a big one to know. Acculturation used to be thought of as existing on one continuum. Now researchers realize there are two separate continua. And I'm going to pull the PowerPoint up for that. You may know it, but people used to think, well, if you're highly involved in mainstream culture, this is how people used to think of acculturation. That means you're probably not practicing the traditions and values or being highly involved in your culture of origin. And if you're highly involved in your culture of origin, that means you're not really involved in mainstream culture. And the model was the longer you're exposed to a larger group of people, the more likely over time you're going to become like that larger group. So does everybody get that idea? It's unipolar and these things are pitted against each other. Unipolar just means it's like there's one line with one thing at one end and one at the other. But people in the 1980s started saying, well, these are separate issues. They're not, just because you're highly involved in one doesn't mean you can't also be highly involved in the other, or vice versa. You could be not involved in either culture. Being highly or not highly involved in one culture doesn't have any logical implications about how highly or not highly involved you are in the other culture. And so the idea is you could be anywhere in this hypothetical space. Here's the culture of origin. You could be highly involved in your culture of origin and maybe also highly involved in the mainstream culture. And it's not like there's just four types of people or four types of ways people can be acculturated. It's more complex than that, but at least this is a start at being a bit more sophisticated in thinking about it. Where he says, you know, if you're highly involved, I think I've got it on the next page here, in both cultures, that's bicultural or integrated, or those are labels he used. And he said, Barry, the person who developed this idea, he said, I think this is really a helpful way for people to acculturate, and the word acculturation, you should know this too, refers to the process of change when one culture comes into contact with another culture. So you as a person could change, or your whole group of people might change when you come into contact with a number of people from another culture. So that's what acculturation is, and the idea is, you know, you could become bicultural, you could become assimilated, which is modeled on this unidimensional thing, and that assimilated is where you're more involved in the larger culture and not so involved in your culture of origin. And you could be separated, which is where you're highly involved in your culture of origin, but not in the larger culture. Or you could be marginal, which is not very highly involved or not very involved in either cultural group. And you should know that marginal people have a lot of problems. People who are not who say on questionnaires that neither culture is important to them and they're not involved in either culture very much. It's associated with mental illness, substance abuse, delinquency, things like this, being in trouble with the law. So it's not a great, that doesn't mean everybody who answers a questionnaire like that is going to have problems like that, but your odds of having those problems are higher. And people typically who are categorized as marginal on questionnaires, they have the lowest levels of education and income. And the opposite is true for people categorized as bicultural. They tend to have the highest levels of education and income. So you need to know those two things. And then for these other two groups, what I said was there was a study with Native Americans where they got people's acculturation status, and adolescents who were scoring as separated / traditional or assimilated, 3 years later they came back, they administered the test again. A lot of these kids had moved to a bicultural status. And you see that on the video, like with specific people, but there's this pattern that you find in research like this. So there's a girl who was raised not to be Native American, and she asked her dad when she was an adolescent, well, like, how come you raised me that way? And he's like, well, that's the way I was raised. And he said, I asked my mother, like her grandmother, why did you raise me that way? And his mother kind of said, well, I wanted to protect you from discrimination, basically. But what you see with the daughter is, so she's assimilated that early, but she starts getting involved in Native American cultural groups, like organizations, and she's one of the leaders at this powwow, and she brings her whole family back into learning about their culture of origin and practicing those practices, and so they became more bicultural. And then you also see kids in the video on the Hopi Reservation where they're separated, basically, but a lot of them are talking about, when I get out of high school, I want to go into an urban area where there's not a lot of other Native Americans, and they want to learn about that culture. So it is kind of like if you've got interest in, now that doesn't mean it's always going to happen like this, but if you've got interest in one culture, you often will start getting interested in the other culture. And that's what the research found, and that's what you need to know. So again, for this part, there's a lot here. People used to think of if you're involved in one culture, you can't be involved in the other, but now people realize they're separate issues. And there's 4 types of acculturation status. If you're highly involved in both, that's bicultural. If you're involved mostly with your culture of origin, that's separated or traditional. If you're involved mostly with the larger culture but not your culture of origin, that's assimilated. And if you're not involved in either culture, that's marginal. And marginal people have the worst outcomes, often big problems, lowest levels of income and education. Bicultural have the highest levels of income and education. And then the other 2 groups, the only thing you need to know about them is that they tend to become more bicultural over time. So I'm saying a lot there, but that's what you need to know for the test. And I'm hopefully taping it so you can look at it on integrity if you missed what I said. And the last thing in Unit 7 is, oh, well, I already said that too. So the outcomes are assimilated and separated kids become more bicultural. Marginal has the lowest levels of education, and bicultural tends to show the best patterns of adjustment. I mean, that doesn't mean you should just tell people they should be bicultural. And, you know, I think some of it depends on your situation. But anyway, in terms of the general patterns, that's what you see. Any questions about anything? Thanks for being here. Friday afternoon. And so both the intensive study session should be on Tegrity, and this one should be there if you need to review anything. Thanks for coming out, and good luck on your preparation for the test. Pardon me? Yeah, you too.